The forest stood silent, a frozen wasteland under a sky the color of ash. Trees, gnarled and ancient, clawed at the twilight with skeletal fingers. Wind howled through them, a mournful, lonely sound. Snow, piled high and undisturbed, swallowed all sound but the creak of the trees and the whine of the wind. This was the domain of winter, a place of stark beauty and hidden dangers, a place where men were unwelcome, their presence a fleeting intrusion in the face of nature's raw power. The biting cold cut through even the thickest firs, a constant reminder of the unforgiving wilderness that surrounded them. It was a place where the darkness held its breath, and something ancient and hungry watched from the shadows. 3 figures moved through the trees, their breath misting in the frigid air. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound being the crunch of snow beneath their boots. Each step seemed to echo in the vast emptiness, a reminder of how isolated they were in this frozen wilderness. They were hunters, bundled against the cold, their faces grim and weathered. The harsh conditions had left their mark, etching lines of hardship and determination into their skin. Their eyes, sharp and vigilant, scanned the surroundings for any sign of movement. They had been tracking a stag for days, their supplies dwindling with each passing hour. The tracks they followed were fresh, but the elusive creature always seemed one step ahead. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, a constant reminder of their dwindling rations. "We should turn back," Mark muttered, his voice barely audible above the wind. The cold was relentless, seeping through their layers of clothing and chilling them to the bone. The thought of returning empty-handed weighed heavily on his mind. It's getting late. He pulled his furs tighter around him, his eyes darting nervously towards the deepening shadows. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees whispering secrets that only the wind could understand. There was an edge to his voice, a tremor that spoke of more than just the cold. Fear was creeping in, an uninvited guest that threatened to unravel their resolve. The forest, with its ancient trees and hidden dangers, was a formidable adversary. "Don't be a coward, Mark," Jake scoffed, his breath crystallizing in the air. His tone was dismissive, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The forest had a way of testing even the bravest of souls, and Jake was no exception. "We're close. I can feel it." He adjusted the rifle slung over his shoulder, his gaze fixed on the trail ahead. Determination burned in his eyes, a fierce resolve to see their mission through. The stag was out there, and he was determined to bring it down. His confidence did little to ease the growing unease that settled over them like a shroud. The forest was a living entity, its presence palpable and oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed to carry a hidden threat. The third hunter, John, remained silent, his face unreadable. He was a man of few words, preferring to let his actions speak for him. His silence was a comfort to some, a mystery to others. He scanned their surroundings, his hand never straying far from the hunting knife sheathed at his belt. The knife was a trusted companion, a tool that had saved his life more than once. In this unforgiving landscape, it was a lifeline. He had seen enough winters to know that the forest held secrets best left undisturbed. The whispers in the woods were not to be taken lightly, for they spoke of ancient things, of shadows that moved unseen. As the hunters pressed on, the forest watched, waiting. As they huddled around a crackling fire that night, the icy grip of the forest seemed to tighten. The cold was relentless, seeping through their layers of clothing and biting at their skin. The forest around them was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows that writhed and twisted like living things. The fire was their only source of warmth and light, a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. Each flicker of the flames seemed to bring the shadows to life, creating shapes that played tricks on their eyes. Mark, his face pale and drawn, stared into the flames, lost in thought. His mind was a whirl of memories and fears, each one more unsettling than the last. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. "Ever heard of the Wendigo?" he asked suddenly, his voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, heavy with dread. It was a name that carried with it a weight of ancient fear, a legend that had been passed down through generations. Jake snorted. Old wives' tales, meant to scare children. But even as he dismissed the story, there was a flicker of unease in his eyes. The forest had a way of making even the most skeptical believe in the impossible. But John, his eyes narrowed, leaned forward. "Tell us, Mark." His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a hint of curiosity mixed with fear. He wanted to know more, even if it meant confronting the unknown. And so Mark, his voice low and hesitant, spoke of the legend. He recounted the tales he had heard as a child, stories of a creature that roamed the frozen wilderness, preying on the unwary. His words painted a vivid picture of terror, each detail more horrifying than the last, of a creature born of greed and despair, a twisted mockery of man, driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. It was said to be a spirit of the cold, a being that thrived in the harshest of winters, feeding on the fear and flesh of those who crossed its path. A creature that stalked the frozen wilderness, its presence heralded by the sound of the north wind howling like a hungry beast. The wind seemed to carry its cries, a mournful wail that sent shivers down the spine of anyone who heard it. He described its gaunt frame, all sharp angles and jutting bones, its skin stretched taut over a skeletal frame. It was a sight that could freeze the blood in your veins, a vision of death and decay that haunted the darkest corners of the mind. He spoke of its eyes, burning with a cold, malevolent light, and its teeth, jagged and sharp as shards of ice. Those who had seen it and lived to tell the tale spoke of a terror that could not be put into words, a fear that lingered long after the creature had vanished into the night. The tale hung heavy in the air, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire. The night was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel like you'll never be warm again. The fire was their only solace, a small beacon of warmth and light in an otherwise dark and unforgiving wilderness. Jake, though trying to appear nonchalant, couldn't shake off a shiver that ran down his spine. He pulled his coat tighter around him, but it did little to ward off the chill. His eyes darted around the dark forest, every rustle of the wind sounding like a whisper of something sinister lurking just out of sight. The shadows cast by the flames seemed to writhe and contort, taking on monstrous shapes in the periphery of his vision. Each flicker of the firelight brought new, grotesque forms to life, making it hard to distinguish between reality and imagination. The forest seemed alive, breathing, and watching them with unseen eyes. John, his face etched with concern, stared into the flames. He had always been the rational one, the skeptic who dismissed ghost stories and legends as mere fabrications. But tonight, something felt different. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, and even he couldn't deny the feeling of being watched. He had heard the stories, dismissed them as mere folklore, tales of spirits and creatures that roamed the forest at night, preying on the unwary. He had laughed them off, confident in his belief that such things were nothing more than the product of overactive imaginations. But now, with the fire casting eerie shadows and the wind howling through the trees, he wasn't so sure. But out here, in the heart of the wilderness, with the wind howling like a banshee and the temperature plummeting with each passing hour, doubt gnawed at the edges of his mind. The isolation was palpable, the vast expanse of the forest stretching out in all directions, a reminder of just how small and vulnerable they were. The fire, though comforting, seemed to be a fragile barrier against the encroaching darkness. Mark, his face pale and drawn, stared into the flames, his eyes wide with a terror that ran deeper than the cold. He had always been the superstitious one, the first to believe in the supernatural. And tonight, his fears seemed to be manifesting before his very eyes. Every crackle of the fire, every gust of wind seemed to carry with it a whisper of something otherworldly. He had seen something in the woods, something that chilled him to his core. A shadowy figure just at the edge of the firelight, watching them with eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. It had been there for only a moment, but that moment was enough to leave a lasting impression, a mark of fear that he couldn't shake. A fleeting glimpse, gone as quickly as it had appeared, but enough to ignite a primal fear within him. The kind of fear that bypasses rational thought and goes straight to the core of your being. He knew that whatever it was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. And as the night wore on, the sense of dread only grew stronger, wrapping around them like a suffocating shroud. The forest had grown deathly quiet, the wind dying down to an eerie whisper. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional groan of the trees and the frantic beating of their hearts. The temperature had plummeted, the air growing thick and heavy with an almost tangible dread. They pressed onward, their every sense on high alert. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees pressing closer, their branches like grasping claws against the twilight sky. The snow crunched ominously under their boots, the only sound in the oppressive silence. Then they heard it, a sound that sent a chill down their spines and stopped them dead in their tracks, a low, guttural growl emanating from the darkness ahead. It was not the sound of any animal they recognized. It was something altogether more primal, more sinister. The growl echoed through the trees, seeming to reverberate in their very bones. It was close now, too close for comfort. They exchanged uneasy glances, their faces illuminated by the pale moonlight filtering through the trees. Then, they saw it. Standing at the edge of the clearing, its silhouette framed against the snow-covered landscape. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its skin, stretched taut over its skeletal frame, appeared pale and sickly in the moonlight, but it was its eyes that truly chilled them to the core. Two glowing embers of pure malice, burning with a cold, predatory hunger. They stared at them, their gaze unwavering, filled with an ancient and insatiable hunger. And in that moment, they knew, the legend was real.